I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes. Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from englishwithkirsty.com. I'm Kirsty, and I support multilingual professionals to discover their voice in English. On the podcast, we talk about language, learning, and intentional communication. We hear about my guests' language journeys and share tips that help you communicate in a way that makes sense and sounds like you. And welcome back to the English with Kirsty podcast. And today I've got a guest here whose work I've been following since 2023 because I checked. Hi, Cátia. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, I started following you on LinkedIn when I discovered your blog. Maybe you could start by telling us a bit about who you are and why you decided to write this blog.
Okay, so my name is Cátia Lima. I teach Portuguese as an additional language. So I have students from around the world. I like to focus not only on the language, but also on Portuguese culture. I've also worked as a content writer and a ghostwriter, specializing in Portuguese culture and travel. I've written for travel bloggers, tourism businesses, and a magazine for expats and foreign investors. Way back in 2013, I started the Beyond Lisbon blog, where I've been writing about lesser known places in Portugal, Portuguese culture, and then other smaller aspects like, trivia tidbits around Portuguese language, for example. And why did I start the blog? Well, at the time, in 2013, Portugal was starting to receive a lot of tourists, and it really annoyed me that most of the people who traveled to Portugal focused on Lisbon, Porto, and the Algarve in the south. And there's so much more to the country than that. At the time, I had no idea, obviously, of how things would evolve when it comes to tourism in Portugal. Okay? I had no idea we would have this boom in terms of tourism. So I felt a little bit like one of those keyboard warriors, but not as bad. So I felt like, yeah, the blog was my way of showing another part of the country that many people did not get to see. Also because they did not know it existed. So I think at the time Portugal was starting to have this boom. And like I said, most people would focus only on Lisbon because it's the capital, on Porto because mostly of its connection to the port wine and all the Douro region, where port is produced. And of course, the Algarve because of the beaches, etc. And there's so much more to see and to do apart from that and beyond that. That's basically how the blog started. And the name, of course, Beyond Lisbon.
Okay, so you're trying to present the other parts of Portugal and about let people know about culture, because I think it is some people come to just to be a tourist, but other people have a different mindset. They want to know more about the country that they're visiting and the culture and the food and I say that because food always comes up as a language teacher as well, or whatever. It's always going to be something around food when we're having people sharing about different cultures, because it really helps you to learn. But I think it's now that's probably useful to you as well as a teacher, no, to your students.
Yes, definitely. Also, and that's something that I started noticing not right at the beginning when I started the blog, but sometime after that, I started noticing that I actually had quite a few readers who were people who were planning, and I mean seriously planning, not just something, in the clouds, but they were seriously planning on moving to Portugal, and they were looking for very practical information. Again, especially concerning, everything outside the bigger cities. And when it comes to my students, many of them are either living in Portugal or planning on moving to Portugal. And so obviously I think it makes, all the sense to not just teach them the language, but in connection to that, to teach them something about Portuguese culture. And so to some extent, there were some things that I've written about for the blog that I also use in my classes. For example, anything that's connected to things like special days like Christmas or Easter, for example. Other dates like International Women's Day, for example. We did some work in class concerning that. I prepared two different texts on a handful of very special Portuguese women. So one for pre-intermediate and another for intermediate students.
Okay.
And it was a way to not only introduce, new words and grammar structures, expressions, all of that, but also to let my students know a bit more about women in this case who will who they will see referenced in many things, whether that's it can be the name of a school, for example, that's named after a queen. Why that queen? What did she do that was so important? And then other women that have to do with aspects of Portuguese culture. For example, one that everyone liked was Dona Antónia Ferreira, also known as Ferreirinha, who was in Portugal. She was responsible for, well, long story short, for the fact that we still have port wine because there was this plague in the 19th century called the phylloxera that basically devastated vineyards across Europe. And in Portugal, obviously, we were also affected. And she, again, long story short, she realized that many families would starve. And if the phylloxera was not in any way fought or, treated.
Mm.
And so she was the responsible in Portugal for that. And that's one of the reasons why she's also very, still today, a very much loved personality in Portugal, especially in the north. So it's, little bits of things like this that I think also add up to when you're learning a language, in this case, Portuguese. It's not just about, vocabulary and grammar and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I didn't know about her, so I learned something today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See? Haha.
Yeah. I should do some of these lessons. Um, but no, I think you're right. I think learning a language can be very distant. You've got no proper connection if you don't know people who speak the
Mhm.
language, if you don't understand something about the culture. And I think that's a really good way that you do that in the blog because you're introducing people in kind of bite-sized chunks to different parts about the culture and the history as well. So now you're focusing on language teaching. What do you most enjoy about teaching Portuguese to others?
Ah, well, several things actually. Um, on the one hand, I really enjoy helping people navigate what so often they see as like, or they perceive as this like sea of troubles, especially grammar, because Portuguese tends to have a bad reputation, which I believe is totally unfair. Um,
Nobody told me about this before I started, so I don't mean that's a good.
so forget what I just said, okay? No. It's kind of an urban myth, okay? Some people say, oh, Portuguese is so difficult, the verbs are so complicated, especially, I have to say this, so especially students who have a bigger background in English and who don't have any context, previous linguistic context from languages like French, for example. So on the one hand, yes, I really, really like helping my students navigate this apparent sea of grammatical complications. But and it's I also really enjoy when I start noticing that they don't pay so much attention to all the rules and all of that, all the formal aspects of the language, and when they start really flowing with the language.
Mm.
Um, and obviously, there will be one or two mistakes along the way, but the fact that they are stepping away from that uh, structured view of the language and approach to the language to a more fluent one, that feels so good as a teacher because it means they're feeling at ease with the language. Um, and then, of course, a personal favorite of mine is when we're looking at something like a new grammar rule, for example, or when we're dealing with fa family, sorry, word families. So,
Okay.
like when we have one word and then all the words are connected to it. So we have, for example, an adjective. Okay, so what's the verb that's connected to this adjective? What's the noun, etc. And when they start being able to do this sort of exercise, drawing from their previous experience with the language, with things they've heard, they've read, etc., and then when they have this light bulb aha moments, that feels so good. That feels so good
I know this
because
word because I know a similar one, or I know a connected word, so I can understand something else. That kind of thing
yeah, when you have that
makes sense.
aha, yeah. So because it makes me feel like I'm not just teaching in a formal, very structured way, but also I'm being like a vehicle for them to uh, do some learning on their own because in real life situations, that's an approach that they will need to have quite often when dealing with real life situations. Maybe there's a word they don't remember. How do I get around to this, to say this or do this using other words? So this sort of approach. Um, and then also, I have to say, I really, really enjoy using, music and videos, lots of cultural references, idioms, which is something that we have hundreds of in Portuguese. I'm not exaggerating, okay, the number. And and we use them a lot in day-to-day life in Portugal. So it's something I really like to do because it's not so structured. It doesn't have to be, and I think it makes things much more interesting for students.
Yeah, and to have people who know about the idioms too, because like we have lots in English as well, but we have long lists that you can find on the internet, but some of them are things that I've never heard of. Some of them are things that my grandma used to say, and some of them are things that we use all the time. So to have somebody who can help to direct learners towards which ones are still in use, which ones
Yeah,
make you sound like
yeah, and
cool.
it's not just that. It's also the fact that, like you said, also in Portuguese we have books with all the idioms listed and proverbs and all of that. But especially when it comes to idioms, there are some that are very much old school, but some are also, I would say, trendy, for lack of a better word. So we have words or phrases, idioms that exist now that are fairly recent, and probably they will disappear in maybe, I don't know, 20 years' time or something. So uh, I think that's also, especially again, for people who are living in Portugal or considering moving to Portugal, I think it's a very practical and useful approach. Uh, because there are things that we say now that we didn't say, I don't know, when I was a teenager, for example, right? Because language is something fluid.
Mm.
So, yes, it's the sort of thing that an app does not help you with.
Yeah, and things that you see are not always like you, if you're having interactions with real people, they're not going to use the things that you maybe learned in a textbook that was written
Yeah,
30 years ago.
yeah.
Language is alive.
Hmm.
Um, and also people who are living or working in Portugal and come across people with different voices. So you mentioned using videos, then that will help them as well to get used to. I try to do this as well, voices other than mine because like the different different ways of pronouncing words, different accents, different
Hmm.
speeds of, so it's really good to get people used to listening
Hmm.
for everyday conversations.
Yeah.
So where do you get your ideas from then? Is it sometimes the questions that students ask you, or is it how do you get inspiration for lessons and for blog articles?
Hmm. Well, for the blog, it's often places I visit, and even more often than that, places that I like.
Okay.
So, in the sense that I think, okay, I really enjoy this place. How can this help my readers? In what way can this potentially interest my readers? Um, and obviously, if there are places that they're not very well known, then that completely uh, that is completely aligned with Beyond Lisbon, right? With the blog.
Mm.
When it comes to my teaching and my students, it's a mix of things. It has to do with patterns that I notice in my students because I'm teaching individually, so I'm not teaching classes. So the more I get to know my students, the more I will notice patterns in the way they write, the way they speak. So I try to, especially with students who already had at least a few classes before starting with me, and again, also people who are already living in Portugal who have a daily contact with the language. Sometimes they will hear something and maybe they've never seen that word written or they won't understand that idiom. So it's a bit about, filling in the gaps, so to speak, with each student individually.
Mhm.
But then at the same time, I also try to come up with materials that I think, especially, authentic materials when it comes to music and video in particular, with things that reflect the way we speak in Portuguese, because in Portuguese, there's a big difference between the way we write and the way we speak. And then within that, there are even more differences with, thinking of different pronunciations, regional variations, different age groups, etc., etc. So all of that basically gives me material, depending on each student. All of that gives me some material and ideas for things to explore with my students, whether it's like, for example, recently, because of Easter, with some of my students, I saw we worked on a recipe for a traditional cake that we make in Portugal for Easter called pão de ló. It starts with the name because pão means bread, but it's a cake and not bread. So it
Okay.
starts there. And then I used the video with a lady who had a really specific type of accent, which was interesting for several of my students who live more or less in the area or are somehow connected to that area. But she spoke really slowly, so that was also really good because it was not so difficult. So, it's all of this. I try as much as possible to um, make sure everyone learns the same in the end, but in a very personalized way, because well, we're not all the same. So I think it makes all the sense to adapt to materials and the subjects to my students and to how they learn and um, their context, basically.
Yeah, we need different things. People learn in different ways. Um,
Exactly.
it doesn't mean you can avoid the things that you don't enjoy so much, but it does mean that there are ways to make those things a bit more appealing and a bit easier to.
Yes, exactly.
And so, do you have any tips for? It's a bit of a broad question, but any more general tips for people who are learning Portuguese? Because I'm sure there'll be some who are listening to this.
Uh-huh. Well, at least one or two of my students, I think, will be listening to this.
Oh, great.
Okay, so
What do you want to tell them?
don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh,
That's the
that's the
big tip.
hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, I know. But that's interesting because it's also something that's connected in my experience. I've observed that this is something that is quite often connected to cultural backgrounds. Uh, some cultures really put a lot of negative weight on making mistakes. And I've noticed that some students, even if they're fully grown adults, they will be so afraid of making mistakes. And it's perfectly normal. You're learning, right? So, uh, but then other very practical advice would be to, and I really defend this idea listening to music or listening to the radio, for example, because even if you don't understand everything that's being said, okay, it's something if you have that as a background noise, so to speak, it's
Mm.
music, so it shouldn't be noise, right? But you get my point. Um, it helps in a very passive way to get acquainted to different words and structures and the fluency, the whole fluency and pronunciation of the language. Because in Portuguese, for example, we tend to um, glue words together. Let's put it that way. Especially if we have, like, for example, a word that ends in a consonant and the next word ends with a vowel, we tend to glue them when we speak. And if you get acquainted to that sort of thing, listening to music or listening to the radio, for example, it will not, overnight, but with time, it will make it easier for you to understand what people are saying, but also to be able to replicate that kind of fluency as well. Um, and I think it's, of all the ways that we can learn a language, I think that music is probably the most fun and light one,
Mhm.
enjoyable as well. So that's a tip I always give. Obviously, it doesn't mean you don't have to focus on grammar and all of that, but music videos, they help a lot.
Yeah, and as you say, you don't have to understand. If you understand everything and you're doing it as a learning exercise, it's probably too easy. You need something a bit more challenging. It doesn't
Yes,
have to be that
yes.
you understand every single word,
Hmm.
but I think it's people from teaching English, the people who do spend time doing that and who get lots of input from different places. They will progress faster because they are paying attention to, how people use their own language, how people construct sentences, what sounds good, and you can't develop an idea for what sounds good if you don't listen to anything. So yeah,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
is
and also with more advanced learners, it's also useful, and especially I feel like this applies to English as well. It does, but in the case of Portuguese, I feel like maybe it applies even more, especially with more advanced students. Um, Music is a good way to start noticing more metaphorical uses for the language. So it's not so strict, right? You get to broaden your horizon when it comes to how we get to use certain words and expressions and all of that, certain phrases. So all of that is like an added bonus, so to speak, when you're learning a language, in this case, Portuguese. Yeah.
yeah, find things that you like, find music that you like. Maybe if you've got some friends, they can give you some tips about what's out there. Because I think, like, in terms of English, there's lots of English music around, but for when people are starting to learn a new language, they don't really know what's around. So
Hmm.
finding people or a teacher who can give you some options. It doesn't have to mean that you like the same as your teacher, but
Yeah.
they can point you in the direction of, some artists or some bands to start with, and then see what you like. Because if you like it, you're a lot more likely to keep listening to other things that they've done or similar
Hmm.
artists.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Okay, and where do you tend to be more active on Instagram or on LinkedIn?
On LinkedIn, not so much. I used to be more active on LinkedIn than I am right now, and I really just feel like I'll be using LinkedIn to share blog posts, not much more than that. Um, on Instagram, well, since I'm not focusing so much on my writing right now, I still share a few things from places that I've been to. But so I am active, but not as active as I used to be. Definitely not.
Okay, but both of them are places where people can get in touch with you if they want to
Yes,
share any
definitely.
comments or
Hmm.
ask about the blog or find out what else you're up to.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on the podcast. Now we finally met after 3 years
Yes.
online. It's been good. good to find out more about you and your work, and I wish you success. I'm looking forward to reading more articles.
Aha, okay, no
And
pressure.
yeah, no pressure.
There will be a couple of articles coming out soon, so yeah.
Okay, that would be great. Well, thank you. And yeah, for everyone else, check out the blog if you can. If you want to learn some more about what there is to discover beyond Lisbon, you can find out on the blog. And for everyone else who's learning a language, whether it's English or Portuguese, just think about what you can do to deepen your knowledge of the language, how it's used, and the culture where it's from. Don't just. I think some people will focus so much on grammar and not getting anything wrong. I'm one of those people. Some people not so much, but
Yeah.
at the same time, you are using you're learning a language to communicate with people. So find people with whom you can communicate and find ways to learn more about that language as well. Okay,
Okay, so thank you so much for having me.
thank you, and have a great week, everyone.
Okay, thanks.